On a private airstrip in Texas, an 87-year-old man steps out of a $20 million Gulfstream Vijet. His face is unnaturally smooth, stretched tight from what many speculate are countless cosmetic procedures. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seem to look through you rather than at you. He's wearing a tailored suit that costs more than most Americans make in 6 months. This is Kenneth Copeland, and for over 60 years he's built an empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars by telling poor people that God wants them to give him money. But something has changed. The fortress he built is showing cracks, and those cracks are spreading faster than anyone imagined. Let me tell you what happened in May 2019 that should have ended everything right there. A reporter named Lisa Guerrero from the television show Inside Edition approached Copeland after one of his services. She asked him a simple question. Does God really need you to fly around in a $54 million jet? His response became instantly viral. Copeland's face contorted into something that thousands of people on the internet would later describe as demonic. His laugh, a high-pitched cackle that seemed to go on forever, sent chills down the spines of viewers worldwide. He told her that commercial planes were nothing but a long tube with a bunch of demons, and that he couldn't get into a tube full of people where people would constantly want to talk to him and interrupt his divine mission. But here's what most people don't know about that moment. That interview wasn't the beginning of Copeland's problems. It was merely the moment when millions of people who had never heard of Kenneth Copeland suddenly saw him for what critics had been saying he was all along. The empire Kenneth Copeland built is staggering in its scope. Kenneth Copeland Ministries operates from a 1,500-acre campus in Newark, Texas, about 30 miles north of Fort Worth. The property includes multiple buildings, a private airstrip, and a massive auditorium where thousands gather weekly to hear him preach. The ministry reports taking in more than $100 million annually, though the exact figure is impossible to verify because, as a religious organization, they're not required to disclose their complete financial information to the public. Copeland himself lives in an 18,000-square-foot lakefront mansion valued at over $7 million. The house sits on a property that the ministry owns, meaning Copeland essentially lives there rent-free while his followers, many of them struggling financially, send in their monthly seed offerings. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that matter. If you're finding value in this content, hitting that super thanks button really helps keep this channel going. Now, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I'm genuinely curious about how far these stories travel. The mechanics of Copeland's empire are built on what's called prosperity gospel theology. This is the belief that financial blessing and physical well-being are always the will of God for believers, and that faith, positive speech, and donations to religious causes will increase one's material wealth. In Copeland's version, which he's refined over 6 decades, the more money you give to his ministry, the more God is obligated to give back to you. He calls these donations seed offerings, using agricultural metaphors to suggest that money planted in his ministry will grow and multiply in the giver's life. Here's where it gets psychologically manipulative. Copeland doesn't just ask for money. He creates what psychologists call a scarcity mindset, followed by a promise of abundance. In his sermons, he'll describe people in the audience who are facing foreclosure, medical bankruptcy, or crushing debt. He'll paint vivid pictures of their suffering, making them feel seen. Then he'll tell them that their breakthrough is right around the corner, but only if they can demonstrate faith by giving, even when, especially when, they can't afford it. He calls this sacrificial giving. The poorest people in his audience often give the most because they're the most desperate for the miracle he's promising. Let me give you a specific example of how this works in practice. In a 2018 broadcast, Copeland told viewers about a woman who was about to lose her home. She had exactly $1,000 left to her name. According to Copeland, God told her to give that entire $1,000 to the ministry. She obeyed, and within a week, according to the testimony Copeland shared, she received a $50,000 inheritance from a relative she didn't know had died. These stories, whether true or fabricated, serve a specific purpose. They create a gambling mentality. Give your last dollar and you might hit the jackpot. The problem is that for every story Copeland tells about miraculous financial turnarounds, there are thousands of people who gave everything and received nothing but deeper debt. But the jets are what really captured public attention and became the symbol of everything wrong with Copeland's empire. He doesn't own just one private jet. At various times, his ministry has owned at least 4 different aircraft. The current crown jewel is that Gulfstream 5, purchased in 2018. To put this in perspective, the average American household brings in about $70,000 per year. Copeland's jet cost roughly 700 times that amount. And he didn't just buy it outright, he asked his followers to fund it. In a series of broadcasts, he told his audience that God had shown him he needed this specific airplane to reach more people with the gospel. He broke down the cost and asked people to donate toward the goal. Thousands did. Here's a detail that makes this even more disturbing. The Gulfstream 5 wasn't being used primarily for mission trips to impoverished nations. Flight records obtained by investigative journalists showed that the plane was frequently used for trips to luxury vacation destinations. In 1 year alone, the jet made multiple trips to resorts in Hawaii, exclusive hunting ranches in Texas, and various other locations that had nothing to do with ministry activities. When questioned about this, Copeland's ministry claimed that these were necessary rest periods for a man doing God's work. The rest was apparently so necessary that it required a $20 million aircraft. The first major crack in the empire came in 2007 when Senator Chuck Grassley launched an investigation into 6 prominent prosperity gospel preachers, including Kenneth Copeland. The investigation was focused on whether these ministries were violating their tax-exempt status by providing excessive benefits to their leaders and misusing donated funds. Grassley's committee requested detailed financial records, including information about Copeland's compensation, the ministry's jets, and the lakefront mansion. Copeland's response was telling. He refused to cooperate fully with the investigation. While some of the other ministries under investigation provided at least partial financial disclosures, Copeland's organization stonewalled, claiming that the inquiry violated the separation of church and state. They argued that forcing a religious organization to reveal its finances to the government was unconstitutional. After 3 years, the investigation essentially ended without any concrete action being taken. The ministries had successfully argued that the government lacked the authority to compel them to disclose information. Copeland had dodged a bullet, but the damage to his reputation among those paying attention was significant. Then came the pandemic, and this is where things got truly bizarre. In March 2020, as COVID-19 began its deadly spread across America, Kenneth Copeland appeared on his broadcast and declared that he would destroy the virus himself. In a clip that went mega viral across social media, Copeland, his face red and contorted, blew at the camera repeatedly, claiming he was blowing the wind of God to destroy COVID-19. He commanded the virus to be gone in the name of Jesus and declared victory over it. Thousands of people died that week alone. His pronouncement had exactly zero effect on the pandemic. But he wasn't done. Throughout 2020 and into 2021, Copeland continued to make wild claims about COVID-19. He told his followers that they didn't need to fear the virus because believers were protected by faith. He held in-person services at his megachurch with thousands of unmasked attendees packed tightly together, claiming that fear was more dangerous than the virus. When vaccines became available, he initially spoke against them, suggesting that faith was superior to medicine. Later, as the death toll mounted and even some of his own followers began dying, he softened his stance slightly, but the damage was done. What profession are you in, by the way? I'm always fascinated by who watches these deep dives. Let me know down below. Here's something that didn't make major headlines but is crucial to understanding the collapse. In 2021, a group of former employees from Kenneth Copeland Ministries began speaking out about the internal workings of the organization. These weren't disgruntled low-level workers. These were people who had held significant positions, some for decades. They described a culture of fear and control. Employees were required to sign strict non-disclosure agreements. Salaries were kept deliberately low while Copeland and his immediate family lived in luxury. One former employee described being called into a meeting and berated for 45 minutes because they had questioned a minor financial decision. Another described seeing huge amounts of cash being counted in back offices, money from donations that never seemed to be properly documented. The most damning claims involved the Copeland family's personal use of ministry resources. According to multiple witnesses, ministry staff were regularly used as personal servants for the Copeland family. Ministry vehicles were used for personal errands. Ministry credit cards paid for family vacations, expensive meals, and luxury goods that had nothing to do with religious activities. When employees raised concerns, they were told that everything the Copelands did was ministry-related because they were anointed by God, and their personal well-being was essential to God's work. It was circular reasoning designed to justify any expense. Then in 2022, something happened that shook the prosperity gospel world to its core, and it had a ripple effect on Kenneth Copeland's empire. Hillsong Church, one of the most influential megachurches in the world, collapsed spectacularly amid scandals involving its founder, Brian Houston. Around the same time, multiple other high-profile televangelists faced serious allegations. Ravi Zacharias, who had died in 2020, was posthumously exposed as a serial sexual predator. Jerry Falwell Jr. resigned from Liberty University in disgrace. Mars Hill Church imploded. The broader evangelical world was experiencing a reckoning, and suddenly people who had never questioned their spiritual leaders were starting to ask hard questions. Kenneth Copeland became a focal point of this questioning, partly because of his extreme wealth and partly because of his bizarre public behavior. Beyond the demon face interview, there were compilation videos showing Copeland in moments that seemed unhinged. In one clip, he's laughing maniacally about the media's criticism of him. In another, his eyes bulge unnaturally as he describes spiritual warfare. These clips, removed from their original context and shared millions of times on TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter, introduced Copeland to a new generation who saw him not as a man of God, but as a potential cult leader, or worse. The younger generation's rejection of Copeland represents a fundamental shift. Millennials and Gen Z are the least religious generations in American history. They're also the most skeptical of authority figures and the most able to spot grift and manipulation. When they saw Copeland's videos, they didn't see a prophet. They saw a con artist. And they weren't shy about saying so. Hashtags like Wajang Kenneth Copeland is scammer and expose prosperity gospel began trending. YouTubers and TikTokers created content breaking down his manipulation techniques. The protective bubble that had surrounded Copeland for decades was bursting. In 2023, the Internal Revenue Service began taking a closer look at megachurches and their tax-exempt status. While this investigation wasn't specifically targeting Kenneth Copeland Ministries, it created a climate of increased scrutiny. New reporting requirements were being discussed. There was talk of limiting the personal benefits that ministry leaders could receive while maintaining tax-exempt status. Suddenly, the legal framework that had protected Copeland's empire for so long might be changing. But perhaps the most significant threat to Copeland's empire isn't legal or cultural. It's demographic. Kenneth Copeland is 87 years old. His core audience, the people who send in those monthly seed offerings, are dying. They're not being replaced by younger donors because younger people simply aren't buying what he's selling. The average viewer of Copeland's broadcast is over 65. When that generation is gone, so is his donor base. His ministry has tried to modernize, creating social media accounts and streaming services, but the engagement is abysmal. Young people stumble onto his content, but they're there to mock, not to donate. Here's something truly fascinating. There's a growing movement of people who were raised in prosperity gospel churches and have since left. They call themselves evangelicals, and they're telling their stories. These aren't atheists who never believed. These are people who were deeply committed, who gave money they couldn't afford to give, who believed with all their hearts that their breakthrough was coming. They describe the psychological damage of prosperity gospel theology, the shame they felt when the promised blessings didn't arrive. because they were taught that financial struggle meant they lacked faith. The family relationships destroyed when they gave away inheritance money or college funds as seed offerings. The medical crises that worsened because they were told to trust God instead of doctors. One woman shared her story online about how her parents, devoted followers of Kenneth Copeland, he gave over $200,000 to his ministry over 20 years. This was money from her father's modest salary as a factory worker and her mother's part-time job. They lived in a small house, drove old cars, and never took vacations because every spare dollar was a seed offering. They died without ever receiving the financial miracle Copeland promised them. Meanwhile, Copeland added another jet to his collection. Stories like this are multiplying, and they're impossible to ignore. The empire is also facing internal succession problems. Kenneth Copeland has children and grandchildren involved in the ministry, but none have his charisma or his following. His daughter, Terry Copeland Pearsons, is frequently featured in broadcasts, but she lacks her father's ability to command an audience. More importantly, she carries the baggage of the Copeland name without the decades of built-up mystique. When Kenneth Copeland eventually dies, and at 87 that's not a distant possibility, there's a real question about whether the ministry can survive without him. Financial analysts who study religious organizations say that Kenneth Copeland Ministries is almost certainly declining in revenue, though the exact figures are hidden. The metrics we can see tell a story. Television viewership is down. Social media engagement, when adjusted for the kind of engagement, shows more negative than positive interaction. The ministry has had to scale back some of its programs. Most tellingly, there have been several rounds of staff layoffs in recent years, always explained away as reorganization but almost certainly driven by budget constraints. There's also the matter of the megachurch building itself. The auditorium at Copeland's Newark campus holds thousands, but recent attendees have noted that it's rarely full anymore. The ministry cleverly films broadcasts from angles that make crowds look larger than they are, but people who attend in person report seeing huge sections of empty seats. The energy that once characterized these gatherings has diminished. You can feel a movement dying. The legal threats are also mounting in indirect ways. While Kenneth Copeland Ministries itself hasn't been sued successfully, other prosperity gospel organizations have faced legal challenges that set worrying precedents. In 2019, a class action lawsuit was filed against a different prosperity gospel ministry, alleging fraud and misrepresentation. While it was eventually dismissed on technical grounds, it showed that plaintiffs' attorneys were getting creative in trying to hold these organizations accountable. If one of these lawsuits succeeds, it could open the floodgates. There's also increasing pressure from within the broader Christian community. Mainstream evangelical leaders, who for years remained silent about prosperity gospel excesses, have started speaking out. Theologians and pastors are publishing articles and books specifically refuting prosperity gospel theology. Influential Christian voices are calling it heresy, a distortion of biblical teaching that preys on the vulnerable. This matters because it removes the theological cover that allowed people to see ministers like Copeland as simply having a different interpretation rather than being fundamentally wrong. The media landscape has changed too. Investigative journalism focused on religious organizations has become more sophisticated and more aggressive. Podcasts like The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill and documentaries about church abuse have created an appetite for these stories. Journalists are digging into the finances of megachurches with more determination than ever before. Kenneth Copeland Ministries, with its extreme wealth and secrecy, is an obvious target. It's likely only a matter of time before a major investigation uncovers something truly damaging. But here's what might be the final nail in the coffin. The internet has made it impossible to control the narrative. For decades, Kenneth Copeland could tell his story unchallenged. If someone criticized him, he could ignore it or address it on his own platform where he controlled the message. That's no longer possible. Every sermon he gives is clipped and analyzed. Every claim he makes is fact-checked. Every extravagant purchase is documented and shared. The information asymmetry that allowed his empire to thrive has disappeared. Young people discovering Kenneth Copeland for the first time don't see him through the lens of religious authority. They see him as content, as a character, as a meme. He's been compared to villains from horror movies. His mannerisms have been parodied endlessly. This might seem trivial, but it's devastating to his authority. You can't simultaneously be a figure of mockery and a spiritual leader to whom people entrust their finances. The two don't coexist. The prosperity gospel itself is facing a fundamental credibility crisis. The theology promises that faith and giving will result in material blessing. But millions of people have given faithfully for years and remain poor. At some point, the cognitive dissonance becomes impossible to maintain. The excuses that you didn't have enough faith, that you didn't give enough, that the blessing is coming but not yet, eventually ring hollow. The prosperity gospel requires constant recruitment of new believers who haven't yet learned that the promises are empty. As information spreads more freely, that recruitment becomes harder. Kenneth Copeland's empire is collapsing not because of a single scandal or a particular lawsuit, but because the entire ecosystem that supported it is changing. The cultural deference to religious authority is diminishing. The legal protections for religious organizations are being questioned. The demographic base is aging and dying. The media environment makes secrets impossible to keep. And the fundamental theology has been exposed as exploitation dressed up as spirituality. In recent broadcasts, Copeland himself seems different. He still preaches with intensity, but there's a defensive quality now. He addresses his critics more directly, something he rarely did in the past. He seems aware that the walls are closing in, that his ability to control the narrative is slipping away. At 87, he's facing the reality that his empire might not outlast him, that his children won't inherit what he built because it's already crumbling. The people who have been harmed by Kenneth Copeland's ministry are starting to find each other. Online forums and social media groups have formed where former followers share their experiences. They talk about the financial devastation, the broken families, the psychological trauma of believing that poverty was their own fault for lacking faith. These communities are providing support but also documentation. They're compiling evidence, sharing stories, and in some cases consulting with attorneys about possible legal action. There's something almost tragic about watching an empire built over 60 years collapse in real time. Kenneth Copeland genuinely seems to believe his own theology. In interviews, even contentious ones, he appears convinced that he's doing God's work, that his wealth is evidence of God's blessing, that his lifestyle is justified. He's either a masterful con artist who never breaks character, or he's so deeply embedded in his own belief system that he can't see the harm he's causing. Either way, the result is the same. Countless people have been spiritually and financially devastated. The question now isn't whether Kenneth Copeland's empire will fall, it's how much longer it can limp along before the inevitable collapse. The money is still coming in, but less than before. The audience is still watching, but they're older and fewer. The critics are still talking, but louder and more numerous. Every day that passes brings another person waking up to the manipulation, another dollar that isn't donated, another crack in the foundation. If you've made it this far and you're getting value from this content, a super thanks would mean the world and helps me keep diving deep into these stories. When the end comes for Kenneth Copeland Ministries, and it will come, it won't be dramatic. There won't be a single moment of collapse. Instead, it will be a slow fade. Fewer viewers, smaller donations, quieter services, until eventually the ministry exists only as a shell, a tax-exempt organization managing the remnants of wealth accumulated during better times. The jets will be sold, the mansion will sit empty, the campus will be repurposed or abandoned, and Kenneth Copeland, if he's still alive, will be remembered not as a prophet but as a cautionary tale about what happens when religious authority meets unchecked greed. The legacy of prosperity gospel won't end with Kenneth Copeland. There are younger preachers waiting to take his place, refining the message for new audiences, promising the same empty miracles. But Copeland's fall matters because of what it reveals. It shows that even the most seemingly impervious empire built on manipulation can crumble when enough people start asking questions. It demonstrates that accountability, however delayed, can eventually arrive. It proves that the internet age has fundamentally changed the power dynamics between spiritual leaders and the people they claim to serve. The empire is collapsing. The question that remains is what happens to the thousands of people who built their lives around the belief that Kenneth Copeland was speaking for God? Some will move on to the next prosperity gospel preacher, desperate to believe that the miracle is still possible. Others will leave faith altogether, disillusioned beyond recovery. A few will find healthier spiritual communities that don't require them to impoverish themselves to prove their devotion. Kenneth Copeland stands in his mansion, looks out over his private lake, and insists that everything he's done has been in service of God. But outside those walls, the world has changed. The people are waking up. The questions are being asked. The empire that seemed eternal is crumbling, one lost follower at a time. And that $20 million jet sitting on the private runway might soon be the most expensive monument to a fallen empire that Texas has ever seen. The collapse of Kenneth Copeland's empire isn't just about one man or one ministry. It's about a reckoning with a theological system that has caused immeasurable harm while enriching a select few. It's about the power of information in an age where secrets can't be kept. It's about vulnerable people finally saying enough. The empire is falling, and when it finally hits the ground, the sound will echo through the prosperity gospel world for generations to come.